This video will offer some closing remarks about contemporary Canadian literature, English 312. I began this course by suggesting to you that there were a number of ways to start thinking about the literature that we're reading, and I can just number them off here very easily. The first was, what is Canada, okay, as a nation? And second, what is nationalism as an imaginative construct? Third, what is the geography of Canada? And then fourth, what is the culture of Canada as defined by different races of people who live here with different cultural heritages or backgrounds, immigrant histories, and of course invoking Indigenous people as well. How is this history played out through the language and the languages that inhabit these spaces? And fifth, how do we imagine all of these things together to construct this narrative and imaginative structure we call Canadian nationalism, and with its people, Canadian national identity? And these are not simple questions that we can just answer in multiple choice format, but hopefully through the novels and the other supplementary readings, poems, short stories, and critical pieces that we've looked at, we've perhaps developed some tools to think about this, that Atwood gave us a kind of, speculative fiction future of this dystopian and environmental disaster, that Canada is a resource economy. We rely on the natural resources of the country an awful lot, be they fish, timber, oil, what have you. And how does technology and our relationship through technology to the land, how does that affect us as a collective people? The second novel, King, continues in this environmentalist vein, but of course brings in Indigenous concerns, that these are First Peoples. And what is the first Indigenous relationship to the land? How does that change under the colonial conditions of the settler history that Canada has? Which moves us into Whitehead, which continues with Indigenous concerns on a much more personal level through the character of Johnny Appleseed and his process of self-discovery, right? And in that novel, he trades in some stereotypes, but really forges a new kind of identity to think about multiple intersectional ideas of identity formation by being queer, Indigenous, two-spirited, etc. Okay? How do we situate that identity in the broader Canadian cultural landscape? And finally, Larissa Lai comes a little bit back to Margaret Atwood in this dystopian future through the technology, but it not only challenges Canadian notions of identity, but also human notions of identity with these strange variations on the human, much like the Quakers, to ask what is the humanity, and then we can ask broader questions about some of the ideals that underpin Canadian national identity in response to, say, global issues, because Atwood and Lai, the novels are very global in their scope. As I said in the introductory video, they're not clearly located, Lai much more so than Atwood, in a particular geography, right? Lai is going on in Vancouver. If you know the geography of Vancouver, there's lots of markers that indicate that that's where it is, with the reference to the Pacific and so forth. But it's really not understood in terms of, this is Vancouver. So we see that the future of Canada is very speculative, okay? And this arguably has been, one of the long-standing questions in Canadian literature, is that the idea of Canada has long been understood as an imaginary construct, that we stick together. And Croce, talks about this in his piece, Disunity as Unity, that it's this disparity, this difference that we imagine working together through our kind of multicultural sensibilities coming out of the 1980s, that we're somehow going to make this fiction of Canada work, okay? And so what I want you to take away very broadly from this course is that I designed this course, partly out of necessity to not cover the very traditional notions of Canadian literature, because I think we all have an inkling of what that is. And we could have done that, but we didn't. I made a different choice in this to try and read very contemporary novels to try and get you to imagine the future of Canada and Canadian literature, that we are not necessarily tied to, although we come out of, those past ideas of what constitutes Canada and its national identity. But a lot of writers writing now have really quite different visions of what is possible within this. And so the course did take a very kind of speculative approach to Canadian literature as a way to prompt you to think about Canada. So if you wanted to go back and read more about Canadian literature, you could certainly take up someone like Atwood in her other novels like Surfacing or Cat's Eye or something like that, The Robber Bride, and read more conventional notions of Canadian literature. You could go to other canonical writers, some of whom we've read, like Al Purdy, who writes a very Canadian brand of poetry, talks about hockey and stuff like that. You could read writers like Margaret Lawrence. So there's lots of canonical, well-known Canadian writers that we can read. We can go back and read Montgomery and Anne of Green Gables and that kind of stuff. But we can also, change quite in a different direction and read much more kind of experimental, non-traditional, inventive kinds of things. And so what we find as we read more and more in Canadian literature is that it reaffirms one of the things that we have, come to believe in Canada, that something like our multicultural commitments, our relationships with Indigenous writers and Indigenous people have created a very diverse body of Canadian literature. That on the one hand, it gets taught in a particular way, and there are certain received traditions within Canadian literature, but at the same time, there's all sorts of alternative traditions that are out there if we are willing to look for them. So I hope you enjoyed the selection, as narrow as it was within the time constraints of this course, and I hope it encourages you to think about the different possibilities that are out there for imagining Canada, and to encourage you to go and read more literature that's been produced within these geographical borders.